Chapter 1. The night destiny brought her a pirate. Spring 1780. Seashore town in southern England. Julienne bit her lip. Could she go through with it? She smoothed her silk skirts for the 4th time. The excited trembling of her hands caused sparks of colour to shoot about the empty room from her expensive jewellery. Dinner with one's intended without a chaperone was unheard of in high society, yet she had taken it upon herself to plan just that, a scandalous evening with her fiancé. It was to be a night of romance and fantasy, one she would never forget. Her chin rose, and her hands steadied. Tonight, for the first time in her vivacious yet sheltered life, she would be alone with a man. Her violet eyes glittered with anticipation. How utterly wicked! Blissfully unaware was she of the truly scandalous events fate had planned for her, one of which would soon find her on an exotic beach, face to face with a dashing pirate, demanding he remove every stitch of his clothing. Julienne Vendant descended the staircase in a lavish display of coral silk, sparkling jewels, and an abundance of ebony trestles tumbling down her back to create the perfect backdrop for her tiny peach waistline. The small group gathered below hushed to admire her grace. Purity and innocence radiated from her fine porcelain skin and pouty pink lips. Yet upon closer inspection, the glint of mischief in her round violet eyes left no room for doubt of her intentions for the evening to come. Tonight, she would have her handsome man to herself, without interruption nor scrutiny. They would be able to talk freely and get to know each other fully, as opposed to the clipped conversations made in the presence of chaperones. This was the man she would soon call husband, whose life would forever be entwined with hers. She and Delmont against the world. Anticipation bubbled within her.
"Julienne!"
gasped her soon-to-be mother-in-law, Lady Brent. Pressing her heavily bejewelled hand against her supposedly stressed heart, she continued,
"You cannot be planning to appear in public with your hair like that."
Julienne raised wounded and confused brows. Lady Brent then turned to her son for assistance in aborting the outrage.
"Delmont!"
Knowing his reply before it came, Julienne smiled. If Delmont were anything, it was predictable. "Mother," he said calmly, "I am sure Lady Vendant is aware of all social guidelines and would never act to the contrary." Taking the steps that separated them, Julienne took her place by her fiancé's side. She considered herself lucky that her future husband couldn't be bothered with such things as the knowledge of fashion and said etiquette that he considered frivolous, for it gave her a taste of the same freedom her parents had raised her with. Most other prospects in her social circle would not be so lenient with her, and she once again silently thanked her good Lord above that she'd found Delmont. Julienne smiled a greeting to her parents, who stood quietly next to the Brents. She did not in the least fear a scolding from them. Monique and Pierre Vendant had given her free rein to discover her life in her own natural way, with occasional advice that she followed without hesitation. The reward of their given freedom stood before them, a cherished treasure of love and beauty, with a tinge of impishness. Lady Brent's bark caused her to jump.
"Whatever happened to your hand?"
Julienne caressed the bandage on her wrist as she answered. "Dr. Totter assured me I will be able to remove it in a few days, in plenty of time for the ball."
"Was it a riding accident?"
Delmont inquired, now examining the bandage. With a sigh, she turned to her fiancé. "I'm afraid it was a toad accident." "I don't understand." His exquisite face was devoid of expression. "A toad?" "Yes, dear," she answered. "You know, the little bumpy creatures prone to hopping." At her mother's slight shake of her head, Julienne smiled apologetically, explaining, "You see, upon descending the steps to the garden this morning, the silly thing jumped right beneath my slipper." The Brent family met her explanation with blank stares. "And?" Delmont prompted. "And he wrestled me to the ground, Delmont. What do you suppose?" Again, She was met with vacant stares. I tried to step over him, you see, lost my balance and consequently twisted my wrist in the tumble.
How absurd!
Spluttered Lady Brent. Monique quickly stepped forward to steer the conversation in another direction. Your chaperones, Lady Bolling, and her escort should be here any time now. Shouldn't they, Julienne? Actually, Mother, Julienne began as she took Delmont's arm, Bonnie and her escort will be meeting us at the Cheshire. We should really be on our way. Julienne urged Delmont toward the door so that they could take their leave before anyone could raise any further objections. Once outside in the drive, they came upon her grandfather. Julienne was filled with joy, for he'd been absent for 2 days. Julienne did not miss Delmont's scowl. "Grandpapa, where have you been?" she asked, taking in the dishevelled hair and shirt half untucked. Alas, she could surmise nothing from his visual countenance, for he always sported this particular fashion.
"Been on a mission, my lovely."
"A very successful mission," Julienne smiled. She knew this statement meant she would never discover where he had been. Grandpapa often went on missions, sometimes for days at a time, and although no one knew where he went off to, she was almost positive these excursions included a member of the opposite sex. "I see you've brought home another cat, Grandpapa," she gently scolded with a smile upon her lips. He frowned down at the scruffy thing seated beside him.
"I didn't bring him home. He followed me."
The cat looked up and meowed, as if to dismiss the foolish accusation.
"It's all these damn fish,"
her grandfather insisted, gesturing to the barren ground around him. The cat licked its lips. "Grandpapa, language, please." Delmont cleared his throat impatiently. "We must be going, Julienne. We don't want to keep Lady Bolling waiting." Julienne suppressed her smile. Delmont would simply never be comfortable with Grandpapa's wild imaginings. She kissed the old man's cheek. "Mamma will be very glad to see you." Delmont handed her into the plush carriage interior. They were bound for the new establishment, the Cheshire, a place for the upper class to dine in public. It was all the talk. Once seated comfortably in the carriage, her shapely brows drew together. She hadn't had much time to explain to her most proper fiancé why neither Bonnie Bolling nor her escort would be awaiting them when they arrived. The Cheshire's glorious surroundings wiggled deep into Julienne's sensibilities. She decided they would dine here at least once a week after their marriage. Delmont wore his inevitable expression of beau monde detachment, which he did so well. The Cheshire had just opened a few weeks prior, and all of those of import in the community had already paid it a visit. Its praise of opulence had Julienne eager to see for herself. So far, it had not disappointed her in any way. It was magnificent. With a deep sigh, she pursued the china and crystal display on their table. Divine. She put her thoughts to the ball being held in their honour in less than a week. She smiled, even had the urge to laugh. They would officially announce their impending nuptials at the ball. Her lip between her teeth, she snuck a glance at Delmont's handsome image across the table. That is if he was not called away on some business matter which happened all too often. Although she had been assured it was necessary for their secure and prominent future, she still dreaded those words. "Julienne, I am well aware that a young lady of your inexperienced years could not possibly comprehend the importance, which were permanently etched into her mind from listening to him repeat the sentiment. Bizarre accident," he mumbled again, and Julienne wondered if perhaps she had been a bit ambitious with her fictitious story. He seemed preoccupied with her little white lie about the absence of the other couple. "He caught his foot in the carriage door, you say?" "Yes, that's what I said." His elegant hand stroked his chin. "And he fell backward into the footman, taking them both to the ground?" "Twisting his ankle," Julienne added quietly, lifting her napkin to pat her lips as she scanned the room guiltily. That poor man. Terrible. She fabricated a shudder and nervously took a sip of water, trying to think of some way to change the subject while shaking her head, mimicking his. "But you are correct. They had quite an acceptable excuse for declining dinner this evening. Though if you knew of this, Julienne, you should have told Mother. Delmont, you know how she is. She would have made a fuss over something as silly as a chaperone." Yes, well, I suppose you know best about these matters. Yes, I do. Bonnie Bolling and her escort forgotten, he picked up his fork, continuing the exhibition of elegant dining manners. With an inward sigh, Julienne let her eyes sweep the room again, keenly aware she was sitting among the elite of England, with who was considered the best prize in the courting pool. It was his fine aristocratic features and considerable wealth that put Delmont in such high demand at social functions, which, unfortunately, didn't agree with him. Her smile was content as she admired the soft chocolate brown of his eyes. Life was perfect. She would soon be married, living in a grand home, hosting many charity and social events. They would host the finest parties England had ever known. She had been holding her own giving circles for almost a year now. Every other Tuesday, a large gathering of her contemporaries would convene in her drawing room and discuss ways they could help those in need. Besides volunteering at the clinic in town, she had also organised baking treats for the orphanage, embroidering the handkerchiefs for the elderly, and hosting a free dinner consisting of soups and baked sweets for the less privileged part of town with the help of the church. Her schooling, as with all young ladies in the gentry, was centred around making a good match, and she had made the best. She and Delmont were already touted as leaders in their community, and she couldn't wait to set a good example for her peers. Yes, her life was grand. She awoke every morning, anticipating the day, whether it would be filled with preparations for her engagement ball, commissioning furniture for the new home that awaited her after the wedding, or preparing topics to introduce at the next giving circle. She scrutinised her journal kept on her escritoire first thing every morning after breakfast, ticking off the completed tasks and readying the next items on the list. In this book, she had laid out her entire future in her own elegant handwriting, down to the names of the 2 puppies she would soon convince Delmont to allow her. Tippy and Buttons would be very happy, she had no doubt. Julienne, an heiress herself, had no interest in Delmont's wealth. Instead, she admired him for his brilliance and integrity. Some of the men who had courted her had shown little to no morality and did not hold suitable respect for their lord, something she would not abide. To gain her approval, they needn't attend church every week, but must at least have a reverence for the Lord above. Compassion for others was another characteristic she insisted upon. She had observed most of her suitors, at one time or another, poking fun at another's shortcomings, or ignoring an opportunity to assist something as trivial as retrieving a dropped handkerchief. Delmont had certainly done neither of those things. Her parents welcomed the match with Delmont. It was her father, in fact, who had introduced her to Delmont after working with him last spring. He often said how much he admired Delmont's ambition and success in the business world. Enlivened by the low rumble of conversation and tinkling of silver occasionally broken with a sound of laughter, Julienne offered, "Delmont, I really am excited about the ball." "Yes," he said, dabbing his well-curved lips. "It is understandable." She chose to ignore his lack of enthusiasm. She was going to be married. She was starting a new chapter in her life, one she had worked toward since a toddler playing tea parties with grandmama while being groomed on the finer points of comportment. She was finding it difficult to contain the need to burst out in song or dance across the room. She wished to stroll about the establishments with her hand resting on Delmont's strong arm. She wanted to marvel at the twinkle of lights, the softness of the velvet furniture, and the myriad of voices just as gleeful as she. A grin escaped as she told him, "My gown is almost ready. I'm sure it'll be as beautiful as you are." "Thank you, Delmont." There was a pause. "Is your attire ready?" "It should be delivered on Thursday." A few more moments of silence passed. Julienne began to realise that this was not the deep, soul-exploring conversation she had imagined for the evening. "This venison is delicious," she offered. "Yes." The tinkling of cutlery filled the silence. After yet another round of stillness, she tried again. "I have found a beautiful tapestry to hang in the study." "That'll be nice, I'm sure." "Yes," Julienne echoed, not knowing how to get the conversation flowing. Perhaps now would be a good time to ask about acquiring Tippy and Buttons. "Delmont," Julienne hesitated, still focused on his meal. "Yes, dear?" "I must attend to my hair," Julienne blurted out. Tilting her head, she wondered where that came from. It was not at all what she had planned on saying. Her thoughts went to her grandfather. She would bet money he said things he hadn't planned on. Yes, she must have inherited that trait from him. Gently placing her napkin on the table, she reached for her reticule. Delmont stood with a somewhat forced smile, as if his face was unaccustomed to the expression. After a moment, she returned the gesture and happily floated off through the wonder that was the Cheshire, to once again become overwhelmed by the exquisite elegance of it all. Julienne thanked her dear lord silently for the grandeur he provided her. She made a mental note of the furnishings to be added to the sketches in her journal. She would like her new ballroom to be adorned with settees and chairs in maroon velvet, like the ones complementing the lobby, and marble end tables, like the ones below the artwork. She was adamant about choosing all her own artworks. Her interest in Oriental artists was her obsession at the moment. She loved how they focused on oceans and landscapes and not portraits, which she did admire, but they did nothing to transport her to an exotic location. In her opinion, that was what good art should do. Her pupils widened, and her brows creased as she drew closer to one such painting hanging on the lobby wall. Anyone who really knew Julienne would recognise those cues as a precursor to her intense scrutiny. Large pupils and furrowed brows meant you would be hard-pressed to capture her attention. The first time her parents noticed this behaviour, she was a chubby 3-year-old in France, visiting with her grandmother. They found Julienne crouched on the floor, staring at the rug, pupils wide and brows furrowed. When they tried to ask her what she was doing, she held up a plump little finger to shush them. After a full 5 minutes of trying to gain her attention and being shushed with the finger, Julienne stood up and sighed dramatically. "Too big," she said in her tiny voice. They were then allowed to watch as a lone ant tried to pick up a stray raisin on the floor again and again, but the raisin was just too big. The same happened when Julienne discovered she could not submerge her apple in her bathwater. The stupid thing just kept floating back to the top. Her eyebrows knit together and her pupils grew wide as she pulled the fruit to the bottom of the bath just to have it pop up again. Recognizing the intensity on her daughter's face, Monique smiled and said to Pierre, "I wouldn't talk to her right now, or you will get her shushing finger." So engulfed was Julienne now in the blending of colours in this new painting, that she failed to notice the scene taking place outside the door of one of the private rooms. Subconsciously, she held up an elegant finger.
"You wouldn't!"
The indignant words entered her occupied mind, urging her to heed their presence. Pulling her eyes from one inconceivably intricate cherry blossom tree, she laid them upon a beautiful woman, practically dragging a man back into the room behind her. "I would, and I intend to," the man said, casually shooing her away as if she were a mere fly. Julienne stood alone in the deserted lobby, observing the spectacle.
"But you can't!"
the woman exclaimed desperately, not caring who overheard their argument. He turned to her and said something in a low voice, then started for the desk. Julienne's eyes widened as she was presented with the most beautiful man the world had ever produced. No, she decided he couldn't possibly be human. He must be a fantastical being of some sort. Perhaps he came from one of the childhood stories her father used to tell her. As she watched his long dark locks shine with every movement and felt his powerful aura permeate the lobby and penetrate her body to lodge itself within her very soul, she whispered, "By all that's holy."
"All right, we don't have to marry,"
the woman was saying as she followed after him. "It was never my intention," came the man's indifferent reply. The woman grasped his arm.
"You are a rogue! You have no heart!"
He turned to her, obviously annoyed, and took her hand off his arm. "Darling, you called me a rogue when first we met. One of my finer qualities, remember?" He turned from her again. False astonishment played over the woman's face until it was obvious it would accomplish naught. Dismissing the act, she started after him once again.
"But I am with child!"
Julienne gasped. "You are no such thing," he told her calmly. Julienne clasped her hands before her. This was clearly a refined woman of wealth and position. She would not lie about a child. How could he just cast her off like that? The woman stopped where she was.
"You cannot leave me. You love me."
Julienne's breath caught as she waited for his reaction. "Please, she pleaded with her good lord. Let him be in love with the beautiful woman, so that they can settle their differences and live happily ever after. Her prayer was not heard. The beautiful man stopped and asked softly, Did I ever say that? The woman's face blanched, and she went still. But Clutching her stomach, Julienne fought the urge to run to the woman and comfort her. She shook her head and straightened. She must not involve herself in others' problems. She must not involve herself in others' problems. She absolutely must not involve herself in others' problems. She could hear a chorus of voices reciting this phrase, for it seemed that everyone she had ever met had tried to break her of this awful habit. She sincerely never meant to become involved. It just somehow happened. She must now make an effort to distance herself from these situations. Problems around the world are resolved each day without me. There is absolutely no cause for my involvement. The man sighed heavily and ran his hand through his hair. Listen, he said, waving his hand in Julienne's direction. I'm married. Julienne's eyes widened, obliterating every other feature of her face. The two women stood gaping at one another for long moments, neither knowing what to make of the situation. The older woman finally nodded slowly. You win, she said, defeated, before swinging her hand up to slap his face. He caught her wrist without effort and placed it back at her side. In tears, the woman abruptly turned and fled. The man watched the empty space she left with a scowl, shook his head, and went back toward the desk. Glancing quickly at Julienne, he nodded. She nodded back. Stopping in mid-stride, he turned back to her with new interest. Their eyes locked, sending strange sensations through Julienne, sensations that seemed to wrap within her chest to keep her heart from beating. Scuttling about in her field of vision was a small, rotund man who darted to the dark-haired man's side. I am so sorry for the inconvenience. I hope you will not think of this as a discredit to my establishment. Everything is fine, he answered, waving the little man away, and approached Julienne. Still shocked, she stood staring up at this being, surely of her imagination. By all that's holy, look at that face. I would like to thank you for... He began, but was clearly at a loss for words. She was mesmerised at the backs of his loosely curled fingers absently caressing beneath his ear as he searched for the words. Being your wife? She offered nervously. He flashed her a brilliant smile that almost reared her off her feet. Yes, for being my wife, he said softly, then slowly closed the space between them, towering over her. Where did you get such beautiful eyes? His voice seemed tangible to her, like the comfort beneath her hand while stroking a purring panther, soft and deep, yet potentially dangerous. Her porcelain-white face tilted up as she studied his perfection. Held within the force surrounding him, she swore she could feel his powerful aura caress her skin. My eyes? She breathed, trying to concentrate on his question. Suddenly, she became all too aware of his closeness. Where did I get them? She echoed as she backed away. Well, they are my mother's. She looked away. That didn't sound right. She seemed unable to look at him and think all at the same time. She swore she could feel heat coming from him as he stepped closer again. Share some wine with me. His eyes were mesmerizing. Rings of copper encircled large, dark pupils. His skin so tanned and smoothly shaven, and his lips so close to her own. Surely closer than Delmont had ever been. She couldn't remember ever noticing the full curve of Delmont's lower lip, or the rich colour that tempted one to taste. So perfect, she thought, wondering what it would be like to feel his lips on hers, so soft, so warm, just so close. Oh! No, I couldn't, she exclaimed, backing away and smoothing her skirts nervously. She had been thinking so strangely of late. It must be the excitement of the upcoming ball. She looked back up at him, about to put an end to this whole ridiculous situation, but found the words stuck in her throat. He was just so tall. He was just so real. She had never been put in a position to deal with something like this. It was true she had more than her share of suitors clamouring for her attention, but she would just giggle and tell them how silly they were. Hadn't many young ladies come to her for advice and even lessons on how to get the man of their choice? Now, who was this man to come and tangle up all her thoughts? How dare he take away her ability to giggle at him? She shuddered from the strange sensations his proximity was eliciting. Delmont had never made her body react in such a way. He reached out a warm hand and gently took her arm. 1,000 words raced through her mind at once. "May I escort you to your table?" he asked. Her lips parted at the sound of his voice, and she backed away. "No, thank you." She touched her arm where it still tingled from his hold. Her gaze was drawn to the length of his lashes, the curve of his jaw, the hollow of his cheek. A slight smile formed on his lips. Their eyes locked again. He was so extraordinary in every way, from the perfection of his features to the way he had treated that woman. Who was she? She asked quietly. It was now his turn to study her face, his eyes searching gently before falling to the floor. He shook his head. No one. She could not believe she had actually asked that. How rude, against everything she had ever been taught. Heat rushed to her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I really must go." Tearing her eyes away, she held her head high and forced herself to walk back in the direction of Delmont, where her heart would be calm and her thoughts and words would make sense. The table was empty when she arrived. Taking her fork, she began to push a defenseless piece of roast about her plate before setting the utensil back down. Glancing up, she noticed a tall man proffering a silver tray with a folded piece of paper. "The gentleman you are dining with asked me to present this to you." She took the note and nodded dismissal to the man. Knowing exactly what the message held, she opened it slowly. "Julienne, I have been called away on urgent business. Geoffrey Glade has brought my attention to something quite disturbing. Upon acquiring this knowledge, it is my duty to depart post-haste. The carriage is waiting and will return you home. Now, I am well assured that a lady of your inexperienced years cannot possibly—" She folded the note, reciting the rest of the unread message quietly to herself from memory. Putting the note into her reticule, she searched around a moment longer as she resigned herself to the fact that her one chance at a romantic evening alone with her fiancé had just come to an abrupt end. She fixed her flowing dark hair behind a creamy white shoulder and began to stand. "Please, sit down," greeted that smooth voice from the lobby as the handsome stranger settled into Delmont's vacant chair. Staring into brilliantly black, copper-rimmed eyes, she found herself utterly speechless.